this is an absolute first for me, I'm going to read from my book on an iPad. Because one of the things I wanted to do with this book was to do a book that was an audio book, an e-book, and a paper book, like a proper book, on paper, like they used to do in the olden days. But it's quite exciting when I saw it on an iPad, because it looks lovely. It looks like a book. And look, this is so exciting. Oh, look at that! I will do a very quick explanation. The book is a unashamedly utopian science fiction story set 200 years in the future in this country, which in 200 years' time, in my book, is called Gardenia. It is a very different world to the world we know now, and a character from our era goes there. And if it was in Red Dwarf, he'd go through some wibbly-wobbly space sci-fi smeg. So you don't need to know how he gets there, but he gets there. And he gets there in an aeroplane that I saw recently that exists in real life. It's an electric two-seater monoplane called the Unique. And this part of the story takes place in that. This is a battery-powered electric plane that actually, interestingly, flies further and longer than a petrol-powered one. Which is against a lot of people's assumptions, and it's also very quiet because it doesn't have a great big noisy engine. So this scene takes place when the protagonist is getting used to the new world that he's entered, and he's flying, which is going to be very obvious now, I realise, in the first sentence. In fact, in the second word. So I'll shut up describing it and I'll just read some. We flew due south for some time. Didn't need to say flying, did I? Over endless forest, broken only by the occasional small field, neatly planted with what could have been vegetables or ground fruits. There was the odd square of oilseed, an occasional field of what could have been wheat or barley. There were no towns, just houses dotted about here and there, and of course many more glass houses. At one point we flew over something that was a recognizable street, with rows of old houses either side of gardens. That's Burford, said William. You may recognize that. Should explain that he's flying with a very old gentleman. He's 136 years old, called William. Should have said that before. And I knew a 92-year-old, let me just quickly explain who this is based on, who had a wonderful overbite, a little bit like Tony Benn. And he was getting very, very excited about engineering projects. So he spoke a little like that. So that's really where William came from. But I might not do that voice all the time because it could be annoying. I'd been for a pub lunch in Burford once with Beth, and I'd done an exploratory bike ride around Kingham. It was vaguely familiar except for the absence of the traffic jugging up the hill between the houses. No road now, just gardens. After a few minutes or so, batteries still at 100%, I saw the sun glint off a river in the distance. Ah, Kelmscott and Old Father Thames, said William. Let us turn east and follow it. There is much to see along its banks. I did as William suggested and followed the river's meandering path. The water was occasionally obscured by large trees, but following its general direction was easy. I was concerned about landing by this time. We'd been flying for close to 40 minutes. If the old fellow was caught short, there wasn't much I could do about it. How are you bearing up, William? I asked. I'm having the most wonderful time, he said, without looking at me. He was staring at the ground. I'm just a little concerned about landing somewhere if you need, if there's a call of nature. Well, the only place I know we can land is in your field. William turned at me and smiled. Don't fret, he said. I'm fine. I'm having such a wonderful time. The last thing I need to have is a wee-wee. A wee-wee. So after 200 years of massive cultural and technological change, people still call taking a piss having a wee-wee. After passing over Newbridge, where the Windrush meets the Thames, another landmark I recognised, we followed the river past Oxford again, with William pointing out various communities along the way. No big urban development, just a series of houses surrounded by more trees. It was only when we passed over the bridge at Henley, again a landmark I could recognise, that I realised we'd already passed Reading, except there was no Reading, just a few farms. Beyond the bridge I saw some strange-looking buildings on the bank of the river. What are those? I asked William, pointing to the structures. Heat extractors, said William. They extract the natural occurring heat from the river and turn it into energy. There are many of them along the Thames. Of course, from that moment on, I noticed these little buildings again and again. I was very relaxed. The Unique essentially flew itself on autopilot, and I merely adjusted the direction every now and then in a lazy attempt to follow the river. After another minute, something ahead caught my eye. I was vaguely scanning the horizon when my eyes just stopped, transfixed by what was before me. At first, the 4 lines made no sense to me. Just 4 vertical lines in the sky, stretching from the land horizon into the misty blue. These thin lines were directly in our path, and it was only when I saw an object rising up one of the lines that I started to blink. "What in heaven's name is that?" I asked as the object continued to rise up one of the lines. As I was speaking, another appeared out of the misty blue and descended at much the same graceful speed.
"That, my dear fellow, is Heathrow. That is what we've come to see."
As we got closer to the lines, another object started climbing up another line, a small, dark, box-like shape. "What is it?" I asked. "I just can't work it out." "Pods," said William. "The ones that look like jewels or maybe tears, they are passenger pods. The cuboid ones are for transporting goods, specialist goods or medicine, sometimes raw materials." I looked up as high as I could. Way, way above us, a small speck on one of the lines disappeared into the blue. "Blimey, William, this is utterly breathtaking. Where are they going?" William turned to me and smiled.
"They go into space, Gavin. They go out into space."
"Seriously?" I gasped.
"Oh, yes, once they have reached the required altitude, they essentially stay motionless while the Earth turns. When they reach their destination, they latch onto another line and then descend. It's how we travel long distances."
"Oh, my Lord," I said, trying not to swear. "What are the lines attached to, like solar kites?"
"Oh, goodness me, no," said William. "No, something much larger. They are attached to geostationary satellites located about 160 kilometers above us."
Wait, I interrupted, trying to take all this information in. "Satellites? So there's a satellite with a bit of string hanging from it, and the boxes climb up the string. But how did the satellite get there, like the first one?"
"Well, before I was born, I'm not exactly sure when. You'd have to ask Paula. A very substantial rocket was sent up which carried the first tether satellite. As far as I recall, this then sent another tether back to Earth, and from then on, the transportation of machines, support systems, and people to work on the systems was much simplified. Now, any new satellite is built on the ground in various parts, then transported into position. The various parts are constructed into a whole, and another line is dropped to the Earth, and so on."
"So how many are there, around the world?"
"Oh, I've no idea. I would say a few hundred."
We were soon close enough to see some detail of the objects crawling up the tether. The more modular shape that was in front of me was moving upwards at a gentle pace. It was soon overtaken by a slightly more cuboid shape going up one of the other lines. That was climbing into the sky at about the same speed as a rocket, i.e. very bloody fast. "Just extraordinary," I said, staring in awe.
"The lines are around 150 kilometers long, as I recall," said William. "They just crawl up the tethers. The pods do have tiny hydrogen propulsion systems to steer themselves in zero gravity. You'll have to add your name to the waiting list. Have a trip somewhere."
"Fuck me," I spouted. Then William glanced a little. Then glanced at William a little shamefaced.
"Sorry,"
he was smiling at me.
"I thought you'd like it. You see, Gavin, we no longer need rockets to break the surly bonds of Earth."
"Wow," I said, finally taking my eyes off the spectacle in front of me. "Do you know who said that?"
"Said what?"
said William. "The break the surly bonds of Earth thing."
"I have no idea. I must have heard it somewhere. It's quite poetic, isn't it?"
"Ronald Reagan," I said. "He said it after a terrible rocket disaster."
"Oh, goodness, was he a poet?"
I laughed. "No, William, he wasn't a poet." Thank you.
Now, thanks for that, Robert. This is my copy of News from Gardenia, significant in that, certainly in the last year, it's the first book I've paid for.
That's very kind of you.
Yeah. And it has my name in the back.
It does have your name in the back.
So let's talk very quickly there about Unbound and the publishing and why you chose to go with Unbound Publishers, a new style of publishing, isn't it?
Yeah. I did want to try. I think initially when I was first thinking about the book, and because I had a lot of experience of doing effectively television programs completely outside the traditional broadcasting network, through using the internet, a slightly different model in that you don't get paid to do it. So I knew there was problems there, and I thought, well, I really want to try and do this with books. And it wasn't so much that I'd had anything but bad experiences with traditional publishing, but I've had very good experiences. But it was there's some kind of extra excitement, an extra kind of buzz you get from trying to launch a book completely independently, and it's now very possible to do. I mean, while accepting that I'm in a lucky position, having a public profile, that means that there will be some people who'll go, oh, he's a bit of an old bore, but I'll have a go. I'll risk it, as opposed to a completely unknown writer. And it was as I was going through that process and investigating how to, put a book on Amazon, and then I was going to print some and then post them out in envelopes. It would have been a disaster. I finally realised that distribution is quite a complicated and skilled and time-consuming occupation. And it was around that time that Unbound just sort of appeared out of the mist, and they'd literally just launched it. I think I may have heard about it originally from Terry Jones, who did I think their first book was Terry Jones' book. And I'd met him a few times, and we were talking about publishing and writing and books and things. And so it just immediately clicked. And as soon as I met John, I went, I'll do anything. So whatever it takes, because it was such a brilliant idea. And it was what I had thought about doing, but had no technical abilities to work out how to have my own web page where you could support a book in a kind of crowdsourced, crowd-funded way. So it just solved all those problems.
To give a bit of background there, the Unbound books is you buy this. I paid £25 before I'd even
before I'd written it.
Yeah. But you do get a lot. You do get access to things like what they call the Writer's Shed. What's the Writer's Shed?
Well, the Writer's Shed, if only I had used it more. I mean, unfortunately, the timing worked so that the Writer's Shed is an area of the website that you can only go to if you've supported the book. And it's and the idea is that you can interact with the writer as he's working on the book. And by the time that my book was on the site and the Writer's Shed was going, and I did put some stuff on it, I was in the middle of Red Dwarf, and that meant that I didn't even have half a brain to log into the Writer's Shed. So that was a slight frustration. If I do it again with them, I will be obsessively doing stuff on the Writer's Shed, because it's a great way to kind of sort out ideas. I'd like to post chapters on it and say, this bit, does this character work? Is it, because what you're actually dealing with is potentially sort of 1% of your readership if the book is successful. So it's not like you're spoiling it.
And then it's taken on from there, then, isn't it? It goes from Unbound Books to a publisher, so it will be available in the shops.
So it's Faber's are doing all the distribution, and it'll be in bookshops, and it'll be on Amazon, and it'll be. I mean, in 6 months, no one will know that it was ever not a normal book. It isn't. So that side of it is really good, and also I've actually had quite a good talks with people at Amazon about how that operates, so about putting books on. So it'll be on Kindle and ebooks and all that stuff. And the audiobook as well is the other thing.
Yeah, sure. So let's look at what's inside the book. It's a book about ideas, and it was inspired by William Morris. For those of us, including myself, who don't know so much about William, would you tell us
William Morris was, he wrote a book in 1890 called News from Nowhere, which I read when I was somewhere in my late teens, early 20s, which is, again, an absolutely unapologetically utopian vision of, unfortunately, 1980. And he really, really got it wrong. It's just staggering how wrong he got it, and which is one of the reasons I set my book 200 years in the future. I wasn't going to risk 100, just in case somebody might be able to read it in 100 years and just go, what a twat. But he was an extraordinary man. I mean, a lot of people know him for his wallpaper. He was an arts and crafts. The kind of height of the Industrial Revolution, he was going, hang on a minute, this isn't the right thing to do. People need to love what they do and love their work and make things. And so he was very much part of that movement. He was a kind of early socialist in some ways. I think they did use words like that then. He had quite a complicated personal life, and he was very much involved with the pre-Raphaelite movement and those artists and all those. There's one or two famous paintings of staggeringly beautiful red-haired women who he was married to one of them, but she shagged about a bit, to be honest, to use modern parlance. But he was a wonderful thinker and writer, and News from Nowhere is an extraordinarily fascinating book, really more about how society is structured rather than technology or anything like that. So it's it was very appropriate, and I think popular in the 1970s when there was a sort of huge rejection of mass production and all. There was a lot of people kind of going, no, we're not going to live like that, man. We're going to pull our own hair back and live naturally. The kind of early sort of neo-hippiness of boiling lentils. There was a kind of really genuine sort of move towards finding ways, gentler ways of living with the world, which I think are very relevant and have come back to remind us that that was probably not such a stupid idea.
And it's your book, News from Guardian, is unashamedly positive and looking what happens when we get it right.
Yes, yeah.
And do you think it's inevitable that we should get it right? Surely it's a survival instinct of the human race to do what happens here.
I mean, I would hope so. And I think it certainly started out as an absolute direct reaction to the kind of the sort of tumultuous waves of dystopian fiction, both in writing but also in films. It's, you know, if there's a film about the future, it's always the world's gone mad and people are killing each other and the zombies have taken over and there's an asteroid going to come and kill us and everybody's horrible and it's a fascist state and the machines rule everything and we're just, you know, and you just go, yeah, all right, come up with something, you know, The Matrix, Mad Max. There's so many of them. The Book of Eli I went to see with my son. I went, oh, for God's sake, not another book where he's got to get to the other side of America with a gun. You know, clever and wonderful acting, and brilliantly made, but it's always gangs of marauding loons with guns and flaming jeeps and, I don't know. It just got a bit tedious. And I just thought, well, I would love to go and see a film where Tom Cruise goes into the future and everybody's really nice, and they're all right, and there's no secret, vicious, underground, you know, coven of controlling, freakish fascists that want to murder everybody. It's actually quite nice, and everybody gets on. So really, that was the essential gist of it. And actually, it is that thing, I think, that that the old differentiation between left and right does since the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, and the collapse of all that stuff. And you then go, I think it splits down into people who think everyone is basically essentially horrible and you want to build a fence around your house and keep them out because they're all awful and weird and foreign. Or everyone's basically all right and there's one or two really nasty people in the world, but really only one or two. Most people are fairly all right, really.
Yeah.
That's the gist, and I think I'm on that side, you know.
And